Confirmed by unanimous decision, almost unanimous decision, the Minnesota Vikings culture is one of, if not the best in the league. That and all kinds of other Combine Week takeaways here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You like that on 3, 1, 2, 3, you like it!
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at Luke Braun NFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. And thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day, each and every day. You can also find the show on Amazon Fire or Roku if you have the Locked On Minnesota Sports app. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. We are getting to it, folks. It's March. It means the Combine's going on. That means we are down to 11 days before the tampering window opens, I think. Or is it the 13th is when the league year turns over? And the 11th is when the tampering window opens. Either way, we're getting to it. Now, I haven't really talked about any of the quotes from the Combine, so we're going to do that today. But first, the NFLPA did a big old survey of all of their players across all of their teams, asking those players to rate their team's organizations on things like how well they treat the player's family, nutrition, the strength and training staff, this quality of the facilities, basically, things the players union would care about, right? And wouldn't you know it, Minnesota Vikings rated out number one in the league in the composite of all of these categories. Players just did not have complaints about the training staff, about the nutrition, about family support, none of that stuff. And that's really cool. There are some interesting tidbits from the write-up on the NFLPA website, which you can just go to NFLPA.com and you can just go find. A little bit of a jab at the old guys. They said, hey, everybody's real happy last year, period. Next sentence is, last year they got rid of Mike Zimmer and the old trainer that people had problems with. They didn't even name Eric Sugarman. But in the time since Eric Sugarman was let go by the team when O'Connell and Kwesi got here, a couple of stories have come out from players like Ifeadi Odenigbo and were sort of endorsed by guys like Jeff Badette and there was somebody else I can't remember, of Sugarman not necessarily treating injured players correctly. You can still go find that on Ifeadi Odenigbo's Twitter page if you really want. So that's not a new revelation, but again, it's like, wow, man, I mean, everybody's really had a problem with Eric Sugarman. And now that he's out, everybody seems to be really happy. And that's pretty nice. If you look around the league at some of the problem areas, you go down to the bottom of that list, you see stuff like Arizona charging its players for meals. Baltimore, far and away the strength staff with the least support. Jacksonville's got a rats problem. There's like all kinds of stuff that came out in this that is just going to be a PR nightmare for those teams. And the Vikings come away looking like the place to be. And that rule's headed into free agency, right? This is coming out less than 2 weeks before guys are actually deciding which team they want to play for. That's going to be an advantage. And that advantage can bear out in really tangible ways. This is a lot more. This isn't just puppies and rainbows. This can genuinely be the difference. If you're looking at a Vikings contract for some amount of money and a contract with the Cardinals for $500,000 more, you might take the Vikings contract because you know that they're not going to charge you for meals and you know that they're going to treat you a little better. You might be a little bit more inclined to take the Vikings contract because of all of this information, meaning that the Vikings might be able to get away with signing free agents, and even if it's just a little bit, that much less of a cost, and players will willfully agree to it. That's great news, and the timing of this is really nice, and it's really, really awful for a place like Baltimore or Jacksonville or Arizona going, is that team really going to care about me? Am I even going to enter negotiations with them? Whereas maybe somebody who wasn't even thinking about Minnesota sees that story and says, maybe the Vikings, maybe I should have my agent give the Vikings a call. And now suddenly your pool opens as well. It's really great news. And it's kind of funny. Later in the show, I'll do a kind of a roundup of all of the interesting things that like Kwesi Adofo-Mensah said, a couple things from O'Connell and Flores that have been said at the Combine on like radio row interviews or the official pressers. But one thing that stuck out with me with Adofo-Mensah was he said, our culture is positivity. I forget what question he was even answering. It might have been about Flores. It might have been about something else, but that's like, our culture is positivity. That was like really evident last year. You go through the training camp process, and through a lot of the early parts of the training camp process, O'Connell was very explicit about like, hey, we're not evaluating you, just learn. All right. You're not going to lose your job because you didn't learn this fast enough. No, like, don't feel pressure. Let's all just learn together for a while before you worry too much about if you're like performing. And I think that honestly helped the team get at least coherent enough to, string off a bunch of wins early in the season and get off to a hotter start than I think any of us were expecting. I think that's part of it, right? But it's really fun. Maybe I'm just exposed to the wrong people. Maybe I just need to like clear out who I see on Twitter, what media that I see. But the Doomers are trying real hard to spin this. I've seen somebody was in my mentions saying that this is bad because the Wilfs play favorites and they won't let you cut anyone, and of course they're all happy. They're so safe because the Wilfs treat them like gods. Which, like, okay, that then explain the rest of the players. Like, everything was like 98% satisfaction, which means maybe there was like one player that had an issue. I saw somebody else say that, like, but if you look at the last 3 Super Bowl winners, they all like rank really low on all this stuff. The Rams and the Chiefs and the Bucks all rank really low in these things, as though like treating your players like crap is an avenue to the Super Bowl. And I think we need to sit down and have a talk about correlation and causation. But like, you have to reach so hard to think of this as bad news, but people are trying to anyways. And we need a culture of positivity. All right, let's take a beat. Let's take the hint from the Vikings and let positive things be positive when they are obviously positive. All right. Hey, cut a player for cap space. Now, we don't know if that's positive, right? Because we lose the player, but maybe he's worth it for the money. We can debate about that. But this is an awesome thing, and we should be proud of our team for a minute. It's okay to be proud of your team for a minute. Even if they didn't win the Super Bowl, it's okay. You can enjoy things. It's okay to enjoy things. Let me say it one more time. It's okay to enjoy things. But moving on, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that Adofo-Mensah said, that O'Connell said, that is worth getting into, that has already been discussed, but I will give you my 2 cents on it. And we'll do that in a second. But first, the midway point of the NBA season is here. We're starting to get to free agency stuff. We're starting to get to draft stuff with the NFL. But if you'd rather just bet on sports that are live, hockey, basketball, they're getting into the really intense parts of their season. And that is where you can go to FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, and our lovely betting partner here at Locked On. And sign up. If you're new, you get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use, and you can bet on anything from money line, point scorers, threes. You can jam them all together into a same-game parlay. Don't miss your chance to get that no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thanks again for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. For your second listen, perhaps watch, check me out on Patreon, patreon.com/LukeBraunNFL. We're back up and running. Today, I have a Keely Ringo video coming out. Earlier in the week, had a Christian Gonzalez video that went out, and that one's free to watch. So go watch the Christian Gonzalez video, and if you like it, sign up, and you can watch all the other ones. And I'll probably make some other ones free throughout. Like, I'll probably make the Anthony Richardson one free, and some of the bigger discussions, like the more hot button people, I'll make those free so everybody can see them. But go check it out. Now, the rest of this, I kind of want to just do a roundup of like random news stuff. And most of the news from the Combine right now is quotes from Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell. Also, we'll probably get some leaky stuff from the combine. The combine is great because it is like every agent, GM, and all these draft prospects and reporters and like everybody who's everybody involved in the NFL, like rumor mill news machine, all get within a 4-block radius of each other with per diem and a thirst. And it's like, let's go to some hotel bars and start eavesdropping on drunk scouts. And I feel like a lot of stuff leaks. This is the week where stuff is the most true, but only if it's leaked. The combine pressers, they'll ask, hey, are you really locked into picking a wide receiver? And they'll lie to you about that. But the stuff that gets leaked and reported, this is the time when it is like the most true because some loose-lipped scout let it go after one too many Jack and Cokes. Happens every year, and I absolutely love it. I love how sloppy this part of the like media cycle is. But we don't have any leaks like that I know of pertinent to the Vikings, but we did get a couple of things from Kwesi Adofo-Mensah that are worth talking about, even if you don't believe them or you think it's all a lie or whatever. The first thing that I guess popped out to me from Adofo-Mensah's press conference, and it's going to be different than from what everybody else, because everybody else was like, oh, he was like non-committal about Dalvin Cook and Dalvin Tomlinson, which he was pretty non-committal, but not in the like, he's gone and we just haven't announced it yet way, but in a legitimate, like, we just haven't made any of these decisions. And we were just keeping all our options open, just trying not to commit to anything. And that makes sense, right? They have not made a decision yet. That's what you can say about that. That does not mean that they're going to let him go or that they're going to keep him. It means they just haven't decided. Also that he confirmed that he wants to keep Justin Jefferson in the building. I don't want to be the GM if he's not there, that kind of thing. But also mentioned the like order of operations that needs to go down, which is essentially telling us, yeah, we're going to extend Justin Jefferson and we're going to do it after free agency and the draft, which is standard practice. And then there was the necessary sufficient condition thing, which I'll get to. But first, it was a really interesting question about like navigating the draft board and how to like value a draft pick. And I think it was part of because people are still asking about trading in the division because he's done so much of that. But it kind of veered off into this thing about like the draft versus free agency and a really interesting way to think about it, which he kind of said, the draft is where the ceiling is the highest. Free agency, it's a known quantity. And that's sort of the value of free agency. Because you know what that guy is. You've got years of tape on him. You know what he can do, what he can't do, how to use him. There's obviously still some like probability involved because you don't know if that guy's going to come and play the same level of football for your team. You don't know if he's going to mesh in your locker room. You don't know if he's going to, if you work for the Miami Dolphins, is he going to be a big screw up in Miami when he was doing real great when he played in Indianapolis, like that kind of thing. But for the most part, when you're looking at free agency, that's a known quantity. You know how good he is. With the draft, there's always this enticing thing of, you're thinking about the most that this guy can be, the absolute maximum, and that it's a range of outcomes because there's a minimum that everybody can be too, right? And everybody represents this range of outcomes, but the ceiling is always the highest. You can get a good defensive tackle in free agency, but with the draft, you can get a defensive tackle that you'll never let out of your building, right? You can get and Alan Lazard in free agency, but you can get Justin Jefferson's in the draft. And, with any luck, the Vikings never let Justin Jefferson out of the building. Justin Jefferson doesn't hit free agency. You don't get Justin Jefferson's in free agency. Those kind of guys just don't hit the market because if they're that good, the team won't let them go, right? And it's a really interesting way to think about a draft pick as an asset that has the highest ceiling, but also the highest range of outcomes, and how to compare that to cap space as a resource, right? These draft picks represent these big dice roll resources, and cap space represents this very stable resource. And that's not a way that I've thought about it nearly as much. I usually think more about the classes, right? Like the wide receiver class this year is pretty cool, but the free agent class isn't as cool. The center class for free agency has a couple of guys that are interesting, and in the draft it has this really thick band around the middle, and it's like, okay, if you really want to splurge, which way do you go? Like that, it's usually been more about the people, but not necessarily about the probabilistic aspect. And I think, I don't know, interesting thought. But let's do the necessary sufficient thing. So somebody asked Kwesi about Kirk Cousins generally, extending him and stuff. And it was a very like, on text, it feels like a very like damnation by faint praise kind of quote, which makes me think like, I don't know how sold they are on Kirk Cousins, like how married they are to Kirk Cousins. And Kwesi doesn't seem like he's as married to Cousins as like Spielman was. You know, Spielman was never going to let that dude out of the building. Kwesi is not going, he's going to keep his options a little bit more open. But I think there's a couple things he said that are more important than the damnation by faint praise, let's stir up a controversy thing. But for people who aren't familiar with what he was talking about, necessary conditions are things that have to be true for the outcome to happen. So if the outcome is you live, you stay alive, you must have air. That's a necessary condition. There has to be air for people to be alive. A sufficient condition is one that can be true in that outcome, but doesn't have to necessarily be. It's like an all squares are rectangles kind of thing. So for life, being in Minnesota is a sufficient condition. You can be in Minnesota and be alive. You don't have to be in Minnesota to be alive. So he was talking about Kirk Cousins, and Kirk Cousins satisfies, like, to win a Super Bowl, you have to have a certain threshold of QB play. And he was talking about this mathematically. Like, I think he has a genuine like threshold of you have to be this good. And it's like probably a lot more well-defined than what he'll let out in a press conference. But he said, okay, Cousins crosses that threshold. So he's there. So we have that. And then it's a matter of, okay, how do we kind of take that and put a team around it? So that's kind of the first thing is like, okay, he's good enough. He literally verbatim, he's good enough. And then it was a matter of, all right, so you have that kind of box ticked. He never wants to untick it. And I would imagine that that's the thing that probably got the Wilfs to give him the job in the first place last year. Somebody who's willing to untick that box was probably not going to make it to a second interview, and Kwesi is not willing to untick that box. And that doesn't mean you're not willing to get rid of Kirk Cousins. It's you're not willing to get rid of Kirk Cousins without a plan in place to still have that level of QB play. And it makes me kind of think, all right, they were never going to let Kirk Cousins just walk in free agency this year and go for 2 months, enter the draft without a QB. I don't think Kwesi will ever let the Vikings be a team that enters the draft just with nobody under contract going, we're a team that needs a QB this year. That I just don't think, and most teams wouldn't, but you wouldn't do like what the Steelers did where they're rolling in, talking themselves into Mitch Trubisky if Kenny Pickett doesn't fall, and then they get Kenny Pickett and that's fine. But Kwesi will never let that be the case. And that's what I really took away from that, which is, if they're good, they could change quarterbacks from Cousins, but he talks about the time horizon, which I still think is the funniest corporate buzzword phrase Kwesi has in his arsenal. So what is a time horizon? I think I took some time horizon in college and I woke up in a weird dorm. It was a weird story. Dad, I made that up. But it sounds to me like it's, if we're going to change our QB play, we're not going to piss away a year doing it. And we're not going to put ourselves in a situation where we don't have a QB, we have to draft one. And yeah, that's how you get ponders. I think you should agree with that if you're interested in the Vikings winning a Super Bowl. There are a couple other interesting tidbits that at least stuck out to me that I don't think enough people are talking about. So I really want to keep going on the Kwesi press conference and also a couple of things like that from Flores and O'Connell. One of the questions that I got a lot, that I've gotten a lot with Brian Flores is, hey, how does his new defense fit the roster that we have that was sort of halfway built for a Fangio defense and halfway built for a Zimmer defense, and now we have this sort of Zimmer-ish, but it's a different kind of the cover 7 defense. How does it all fit together? And that's definitely a question, you might even say a concern, that I have. And Kwesi was asked about that, and he said, with Flores, part of the process, he was asked about, like, well, how does Brian Flores approach this roster that may or may not be built to do the things that he typically does? And he said, well, that was part of the interview process, because, like, you don't have to just blindly bring a guy in and hope he has the right idea. You can be like, hey, what would you do with Eric Kendricks? And see if you like his answer, right? What would you do with Harrison Smith? See if you like his answer. And maybe his answer is, well, I'd probably release him. And he understood, the Kwesi also said, like, he understands the market, and he says, hey, I like this player, I like that player, but I also understand, that uh, everybody wants to have a great I would love to have a great corner, a great pass rusher, the best linebacker in the league, and all of that, but understanding that, that's not really how the NFL works, that you don't get to have all of those things on your team at the same time. You don't get to have a roster stacked top to bottom with superstars. And so I guess the draw of Brian Flores is multiplicity, that he's multiple enough to do what you need to do to figure out ways to use everybody, whatever their skill set is. Oh, I've got a thing that, if that guy's a really good press man corner, but he can't really play off man. It's not, one of the big Brian Flores things is when he's in cover zero, the corners play off man, because when you don't have a deep safety, so you have to play off and give way more cushion, and then you play man coverage from there. But if you have a corner that can't play off man, he has tools in his defense, versions of blitzes that can sort of replace those zero blitzes that work with one of your corners playing press man. And if you've got a guy that you'd rather have playing press man than off, you can like kind of put in your versions of that package that use that. And he's got that multiplicity. So hopefully the idea of having guys that do everything doesn't need to be as important. And that is a lot harder to find. And that's something that both Zimmer and Donatel needed, that they needed guys, Swiss Army knives like Harrison Smith. Now, if you have that guy, if you have Harrison Smith, it's insanely powerful because he works in any one of those packages. So the more versatile guys you have, the more options are available to you, the more pages of your playbook are available to you. And then it becomes about what beats the opponent. What do they not want to see? And we have access to so many more options that we should be, we'll be that much more likely to find something that screws them up real bad. But you're not looking at a guy saying, one trick pony, I'm out. And if there's somebody who's really good at one thing, you can bring them in and have them do that one thing and have them be the guy, be the best guy that they are. That is, I guess, what I have kind of heard from Flores, from O'Connell and Kwesi about Flores. But also they were very clear, like he said he's still watching tape. He hasn't even talked to all the defensive players yet. Adolfo-Mensah and O'Connell have said like he's still kind of taking his time to decide what he wants, and that Flores is going to have a lot of power here on who stays and who goes and stuff. So for the Wilfs are meddling too much crowd, know that not only are the Wilfs not meddling, but O'Connell and Adolfo-Mensah are also being very deferential to their defensive coordinator. With O'Connell's presser, there was an interesting thing he said about breather type downs. I forget what the context even was. He mentioned it. I think something about what you're looking for in skill players that can play wide receiver, where he was talking about like tight ends and running backs that can like play receiver-ish roles. And you can say that kind of gives you interesting things to do on breather downs, which I thought was a really interesting phrase. The idea of, you can't run 4 verts every play, like physically. You can't ask your players to do that much cardio. You'll gas them. And so part of play sequencing has to take fatigue into account. If you play Madden with fatigue on, you know what I'm talking about. But you have to kind of take stamina into account. Even with the world-class athletes, you can't ask them to run wind sprints all up and down the field for 3 hours. They'll be totally winded by the fourth quarter. And so those breather downs are part of what's like, that's kind of what the run game is for a little bit. You tell, your receivers, take this one off, or, do a little stutter release just to put something in his head that you're going to subvert later, which is what the greats do. That's what Justin Jefferson does. But, we're not asking you to sprint 40 yards down the field on a clear out go on this. Just, release outside him and get that corner out of this run play. And on those breather downs, he was talking about like the versatility and how it's important to have a running back who can and a tight end who can do the receiver thing on passing downs, but then can also on those quote unquote breather downs, you can run a stick route and then you can come in and block. That's like the point of tight ends, is that they can be valuable in all types of downs. Whereas when you're running 4 verts, the running back isn't as integral of a part of that machine. Maybe they're the check down or they're blocking. They'll have a role. Of course, they're not just sitting there with their hand down their pants, but they're what they're doing isn't going to be as vital to the play as, the actual guy running the go route, catching the ball. And then on a run play, the wide receiver's not doing much, but the running back is carrying the ball. He's reading the play. He's like way more involved in that process. And the point of tight ends is that they don't really have that drawback, that they're doing something vital on all of those plays. And tight ends that can't do something vital on all of those plays are just naturally going to fall down everybody's board. That wasn't O'Connell's thoughts. That's my thoughts on the matter. But the idea of when we think about play sequencing, breather downs, I just want to commit that to memory. And when I'm talking about how he put a drive together or whatever, what were the breather downs? It's just something I want to just kind of tattoo on the back of my head and have in mind. A couple of little odds and ends. Lewis Cine in a great spot. Quote, well ahead of his process. Everybody's really excited about how his rehab is going. Always love to hear that. Of course, we'll see what we see when it's time to actually put him on the field for camp. Actions will speak louder than words, of course. And also the assistant D-line coach that left, sort of small news, you might have missed it, but the assistant D-line coach took a job at Oregon, and apparently he had mentioned that in his interview with the Vikings. One of the questions was, are there any college jobs that would take you away? And he said, yeah, Oregon. And so he got that job, but everything was all out in the open and transparent, no hard feelings. In case you were worried about that, once again, culture. The fact that we can kind of be upfront about that, have a quality year, go to another job, and there's no bitterness about anything in that. There is absolutely something culturally brewing in Minnesota that is paying dividends, and I think will continue to pay dividends in a tangible way. With the Flores interview as well, I haven't talked about Mike Saravo, the inside linebackers coach that replaces Greg Minuski. He was mostly a college coach for 10 years or for 20 years. Since I think 98, he was a college position coach. Then he ended up at Temple and then Baylor with Matt Rule, and then followed Matt Rule to the pros, to the Panthers, and he was there for a while. Matt Rule gets fired. He ends up a free agent, ends up joining Brian Flores' staff. Flores lauded him as a good teacher and stuff, so that's great. And then something that he talked about, I watched his interview with Paul Allen, which you can find on YouTube, that Flores talked about in his intro press conference and here, is block shedding and corners getting off of blocks in particular is really important to him. So as we talk about free agents and draft picks and stuff, that's something to really think about. Like Christian Gonzalez. You can go watch my Patreon video for more on this. He is not a good run game player at all. This might bother Flores more than it bothers other people. And so you can kind of say, all right, Gonzalez, probably not a Viking. And there's actually a whole bunch of reasons why Gonzalez probably isn't a Viking. Not the least of which is he'll probably be gone by 23, right? But even if he even is at 23, he might not be the kind of guy that Brian Flores is looking for. Might be interested in somebody with a little bit of different traits, somebody with a little more physicality, like Keely Ringo, if you're okay with how raw he is. So that's something to keep in mind with Flores and with the Vikings drafting is he called it a lost art, which is stacking and shedding and getting off of blocks and kind of having that suddenness, that athleticism, the violence to do it. There are a lot of people who are block evaders. Trenton Simpson, Clemson linebacker, big time block evader. He's a big dodge around you kind of guy. Once a guard gets his hands on him, it's over. He doesn't have really any ability to stack, to do the lock peek shed, to lock somebody up, get your face mask out of him, and then shed the block. That's not what he does. He'll dip under you and he'll spin around you and he'll move around you, and he's got the athleticism to do that. He's a block evader, but he's not a block shedder. That might not be a Brian Flores guy. Brian Flores might want somebody who is a little bit more able to get off a block once a guard gets on you, which is, if you can be that guy, a safer way to live. Like Brian Asamoah, he's very much a dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge kind of guy. If you get your arms on Brian Asamoah, he is functionally out of that play. And there's a value to not being that, to not being out of the play once a guard has gotten his hands on you. And Flores seems to really value that. I don't know. Just interesting little tidbits, stuff to keep in mind as we try to predict who the Vikings are going to draft and we try to get a sense for how they're going to approach 2023, the stuff they're going to change to turn them from a wild card team into a true contender, right? Because that's really the goal here is, okay, we were 13-4. We won the division. We got bounced by the Giants. How do we take that next step? Well, we're starting to get a clearer sense for at least how Brian Flores intends to answer that question. And we'll have to stay tuned on all of it. Got one more show, and then we'll see you on the other side of the weekend. Keep you all posted on whatever news goes down. Love this time of year, though. March, one of the best sports months on the calendar. Super excited about it. See you all tomorrow. And as always, Skull.